panel session. Yep. Got it. Yes. And our panel session on the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act and Let's Talk Family Leave. We are very excited to have our panelists here today. And I'm not going to say very much other than just a reminder to please keep yourself on mute, so Heidi doesn't have to crack the whip and mute everybody. So we don't have any background noise, and feel free absolutely to use the chat box as you have any questions or comments, but certainly we will have time throughout the panel session for questions as well, or we may ask somebody to just unmute yourself to ask your questions. So I am going to, let's see, I'm introducing Laura. Is that right, Heidi? Remind me.
I'm introducing Laura.
You're introducing Laura? Okay, I'll hand it over to you then.
Well, it is an absolute delight to have our panelists here today. I'm so excited to introduce Laura to you. We are very blessed here in Oklahoma to have Laura. Laura also serves as the chair of COBA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. It is a delight to work with you. Thank you so much, Laura. Laura is an IBCLC. She is a first American Chickasaw and the mother of 4 children. Breastfeeding has been the center of her world for 14 years. Her experience struggling to breastfeed her first child sparked her desire to learn more about lactation. She started out as a WIC participant and has worked as a breastfeeding peer counselor, certified nutrition specialist, certified lactation specialist, registered lactation consultant, and an IBCLC. She currently serves as the Chickasaw Nation WIC Breastfeeding Peer Counselor Program Coordinator. And she will soon, congratulations, graduate from college with her bachelor's degree in healthcare administration with a minor in finance. Her diverse experience allows her to understand struggles from a different perspective. Laura lives in rural Oklahoma with her husband, Dane, and she experienced a variety of breastfeeding struggles and unfortunately had to end her journey too soon with her first child. But successfully, she was able to breastfeed her second child for 2 years, her third child, 4 years, and drum roll please, while tandem nursing her fourth child, who breastfed for 4.5 years. Laura, you're an inspiration to us. Now she is focusing on improving the lives of others. Please help me give a warm COBA welcome to Laura Robinson.
Thank you, Heidi. I am very excited to help serve and reach as many people as possible in every aspect. I'm going to introduce the panelists we have today. First up, Jonathan Fowler, who may be popping in later. I'm going to go ahead and read off his stuff. So born and raised in Norman, Oklahoma, Jonathan studied letters at OU after graduating from Cassidy High School in Oklahoma City. After college, he worked as a financial analysis for the Fowler Holding Company, eventually attending the National Automotive Dealer Academy. He opened Fowler Volkswagen in 2010, serving as GM of the store and as a member of the Volkswagen Dealer Council before moving back to Holding Company in 2013 as VP of Operations. In 2018, he was named president of the company, and he has served on Cox Automotive Dealer Advisory Board and Volkswagen of America National Marketing Council. Fowler Automotive currently represents 11 dealerships in Oklahoma and Colorado. Jonathan has been passionate about serving the community since college. He was a founding member of the Norman Music Festival and serves as president of the Norman Arts Council. He has also served as chair as the Sam Noble Museum of Natural History and Norman Public Arts Board. As a steering committee member of the City of Norman's Center City Vision, working on core redevelopment and preservation efforts, Plan Norman, working on city's next comprehensive zoning plan, and One Norman, visioning processes with the Norman Economic Development Coalition. Additional services includes the Pioneer Library Systems Board of Directors, the State Capital Preservation Commission, appointed by the Governor of Oklahoma in 2018, and the Road User Charge Task Force, which studies how roads and bridges should be funded as technology and inflation negatively impact the effectiveness of gas tax as a sole funding source. Jonathan is a graduate of Leadership Norman, Leadership Arts, and Leadership Oklahoma. His most prized accomplishments to date is convincing his wife, Natalie, to marry him and have children. They have a 9-year-old daughter, Winnie, and a 7-year-old son, Ezra. And then we have Cheryl, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. Lebedevitch serves as Senior Policy and Communication Manager of the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee, USBC. Cheryl leads the USBC policy and communications teams and serves as co-steward of the workshop support constellation. She serves as editor-in-chief of the weekly e-newsletter Staying Abreast, Weekly Wire, and a contributing author to the Office of Disease Prevention Health Promotion Report, the role of law and policy in assisting families to reach healthy people's maternal, infant, and child health breastfeeding goals in the United States. Cheryl joined the USBC in 2009 and has held many titles and responsibilities during her time with the organization. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago, completed an undergraduate fellowship at the Newberry Library, and is currently attending the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth as a master's in public policy student. Cheryl lives on Cape Cod with her husband and children, who frequently can be spotted at USBC events. And lastly, but not least, we've got Jessica Parker. Jessica Parker has begun her career with the Wage and Hour Division as an investigator enforcing federal labor laws in 2012. She moved into her current role in 2014, providing community outreach and compliance education to employees, employers, and stakeholders. Her work also involves planning, monitoring, evaluating processes for the agency's local, regional, and national initiatives. Prior to joining WHD, Parker entered federal services as a claims representative for Social Security Administration, followed by a break in federal services to teach high school accounting, web design, computer applications, and other business courses. Parker attended the Spear School of Business in Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. She transferred to East Central University and graduated with a distinguished honors, receiving a bachelor's degree, a science degree in business management and marketing. Parker has also completed postgraduate coursework in business law. Parker and her husband have live on a farm outside. Oh, my computer froze. Hold on. There we go. Outside of a farm, small town, central Oklahoma, where they are raising 3 active boys. All of the titles she's held. Boy mom is her absolute favorite. Let's give a warm welcome to our panelists for our meeting. Heidi, are you sharing the slides?
I think we'll just get right to the questions, Laura.
Oh, right to the questions. Okay. Let me pull those up. Okay, so we've got some questions. This can be answered by all of you or any of you that want to chime in. It's been said that the Pump Act is the floor and not the ceiling. What do you see as next steps for the Pump Act? How do you see the Pump Act affecting states and in terms of offering greater protections?
Sure, I can get us started. So just to kind of ground us all, the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act was just signed into law in December 2022. It's a big deal. What this law did is it took our existing protections that have been available since 2010 on the federal level, which require reasonable break time in a private non-bathroom space for breastfeeding employees to pump during the workday. So that original law was the very first time that federal law had ever addressed the needs of breastfeeding workers. And the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act, all these years later, became the very first standalone breastfeeding bill to get a recorded vote on either the House or the Senate floor. So we've had bills passed before on the federal level, but always as part of a package, a larger package. So this was, or through voice vote, I should say. So it's just non-controversial and it just went through easily. This was an actual recorded vote, which was really, really exciting. So it really maintained those same components of that original break time for nursing mothers law. It's still reasonable break time and a private non-bathroom space for employees to pump during the workday. Unfortunately, what it didn't do is it does not cover flight crew members. So for me, the next step for the Pump Act and really moving that forward means covering every single worker. We know that this can be done safely in an airport situation or in flight. We see pilots and hear stories from flight attendants who are already doing this. They are as interested in getting home safely as anybody else on that flight. So we know it can be done. So I think making sure that every single worker across the nation, that's really, to me, the most immediate next step. I think the other thing is really looking at implementation of these existing protections. So it really can be tricky for folks to understand, like you hear accommodation, it can be an intimidating word if you've we all know because we're in this breastfeeding field, but if you've not encountered it before, you might not have any idea what that means. So it really is going to take a lot of effort to make sure folks understand, like, this is not a big scary thing. This is the reality. Like, this is the practical of what it actually, what does a lactation accommodation mean? It doesn't mean spending millions of dollars. Like, it can be very simple. So I think demystifying is an important next step. Yeah, I'll pause there, and Jessica, welcome any additional thoughts that you have.
Jessica, I do have a question. Can you cover more about who would be covered by the Pump Act and who's still not covered by the Pump Act?
Sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here. See a few familiar faces, and I love it. Cheryl, she summarized very well, actually, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. So the word cover is kind of it's a strange word with the DOL, because when we talk about cover, we're talking about employers. Who does the law apply to? And so the bottom line is all employers who are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act are also subject to the Pump Act unless they have fewer than 50 employees and they can prove that compliance with the law would cause them an undue hardship. So, this is part of the law that didn't change, right? The break time for nursing mothers the coverage as far as the employer goes is the same. If the employer is covered, which most of them are, there are very, very few employers in America who are not covered by the FLSA. But if the employer is covered, then that means that everybody that works for them is also protected by the law. And also, like Cheryl said, back in December, when the Pump Act was signed into law, it amended the FLSA and it extended this reasonable break time and the space requirements to as many as 9 million more employees who weren't previously protected. So it really helped out a lot more people. And the Pump Act, they extended the protections for executive, administrative, professional, outside sales employees, those people who were considered exempt from minimum wage and overtime. They didn't used to be covered by this protection, but now they are. It also includes agricultural and certain transportation workers who weren't included in the break time for nursing mothers provisions. With few exceptions, an employer cannot deny a nursing mother time to pump. So essentially everybody's protected or covered by the law. And also, like Cheryl said, there is only one exemption right now, and it's for pilots and flight attendants. There is a temporary exemption in place for certain employees of rail carriers and motor coach operators, but that's going to end in December of 2025. So when I'm talking to employers, I'm like, you might as well just get ready right now. It's coming. Just do it. And even when I'm talking to, airline employees, we still, the law is the minimum. It's the least you can do. You can always go above and beyond and find ways to bring in these protections for your workers. But pretty much everybody's covered if we're looking at who the law protects.
Jessica, you mentioned break times, and this is a constant question that I get from many clients whenever they're returning back to work. I would love to know your insight on, do workers have to use their existing break times to go pump? And does this break time, can it be a paid break, or is it they need to clock out to break? Or is it more of a company by company basis?
Well, what the law requires is, the law does not require compensation for this break time. That doesn't mean to say that employers can't pay. It just means that the law doesn't require it. And the FLSA does require employers to provide nursing employees reasonable break time, right? Each time that employee needs to pump, and it's for 1 year after the child's birth. Reasonable is, subjective, because the frequency, the duration, the timing of breaks, that will vary depending on factors that are related to the nursing employee and the child. And, everybody's different, and as far as their needs go when they're pumping. An employee and an employer can agree on a certain schedule based on that employee's need to pump, but the employer cannot require an employee to adhere to that schedule if it doesn't meet their needs, right? So they have to be flexible. Even if they have this schedule set out and the mom needs to go, take an unscheduled pump, then so be it, that she gets to do that. So any agreed upon schedule also needs to be adjusted as that time moves. As mothers know, when the babies are very, very small, you have to pump more often. And then as they get older, maybe not so often. And so the employer has to be willing to, adjust that, the break time as needed. And as far as the compensation goes, when an employee is using their break time at work, they have to be completely relieved from duty, right? So they cannot be pumping and working at the same time. That means checking emails, answering the phone, nothing. They are completely relieved of duty. And if they are not completely relieved from duty, then they do have to be paid for that time. Now, the other kind of caveat here is if the employer provides break times for employees, say, for instance, they get a 15-minute, everybody gets a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon. Those are called short break periods, and those, by law, those have to be paid if they're allowed. If the mother uses that time to pump, then she has to be paid just like everybody else. Now, if say she needs an extra 15 minutes, then that first 15 minutes that everybody got paid, she'd be paid for that. But then if she needs the extra 15 minutes, the employer would not be obligated to pay her for that time.
Thank you so much for that. Cheryl, this question's for you. The Center of Health, Equity, Education and Research honored you this year as its cheer champion of the week for your tireless work to get the PUMP Act passed. You were involved from the very beginning in the numerous discussions over years with many stakeholder groups. I'm sure it felt at times that you were birthing a baby. Can you describe the process that was like to get this passed, and what victory you must have felt after?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was definitely an honor to be recognized by Cheer. I mean, that being said, the real beauty of the PUMP Act is how incredibly collaborative it was. So this bill really started in the workplace support constellation that probably doesn't hold a lot of meaning, but essentially it's what we call our action focused work groups at USBC. So when we bring together organizations who are like, we have a shared goal, we want to work together on something, they form what's called a constellation. And that group, way back when, developed a model legislation. So we've been trying ever since the break time law was passed in 2010, immediately recognizing the coverage gaps, which the PUMP Act worked to close. So there had been bills that were introduced in every session after the passage of the break time for nursing mothers law wasn't really getting there. Just wasn't getting the right momentum. So this group was like, all right, we're going to come together and we're going to really tackle this issue. And that first step was developing this model legislation. So we took that piece. It included all kinds of partners. There are already over 30 organizations involved. So we had folks from the healthcare field, we had worker advocacy folks, we had lawyers, we had, all these different sectors of people really recognizing that we needed to have these broad perspectives so that we didn't end up having unintended consequences. When the break time law passed, they didn't realize that there was going to be this major gap. It was inadvertent, and we didn't want to have that mistake again. So thankfully, when we took that model legislation to the congressional champions who had already been working on this legislation, they took it on and were fully in support, which was really exciting. So we didn't have to shop for, different congressional champions or anything like that, which was really great. But of course, introducing the bill is just one almost the simplest step, ironically, in the legislative process. So that model legislation was first introduced, so we're currently in the 118th congressional session. It passed in the 117th, but it actually was introduced for the first time in the 116th session. Once it goes through introduction, you have to get a hearing and a markup and have passage through hearing and markup in those committees, both the House and the Senate side. Then it has to get passed by the full House, the full Senate. If there's differences, they have to be conferenced. If it doesn't go through all the steps in that process, you have to start again the next session. So we had gotten it pretty far in the 116th, not all the way. So last year, we really still had all of our people who were really committed to moving this forward. USBC was just one of the groups stewarding it through this process. There was also the National Awake Association, Moms Rising, the Center for Work-Life Law, A Better Balance, and American Civil Liberties Union. And you know, we had to pick ourselves up and start all over again. So we got an introduction. We had really swift movement because of that, the momentum that we had built during the previous session to get through markup and get through that initial step. Like you had to have enough energy and buy-in to sort of warrant this stuff to happen. In order to really get there, what it required was a lot of negotiation. So we understood that we needed to have the business perspective included. So we were working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, with the House Ed and Labor Committee, you know, all of these advocates on the ground to come up with negotiated language that everybody could really stand behind. And that included some pretty significant changes from the initial, you know, what was introduced in the bill. Not all of that made it into the final version, but because of that buy-in, it was able to pass through, you know, the House committee. It actually did go through, however, it was a pretty partisan vote, which was unfortunate, especially with the business buy-in. On the Senate side, it actually moved forward using the original introduced language. So it was two very different processes from each other. And on the Senate side, it actually passed through the Senate Health Committee with full bipartisan unanimous support. Every single member on that committee was in full support of passing that legislation, which was really exciting. It did go through the House, was the next step that it took, and it had a really incredible bipartisan vote. Despite that partisan vote in the committee, when it really came to the full House, there was really strong support, which was really exciting. Of course, now we still needed to move it through. We had gotten it, you know, House committee, full House. We had gotten it through Senate committee, but it hadn't gotten through the full Senate. And if you've ever watched any sort of proceeding about anything, it is really hard to move things through the Senate. And they have very different rules on each side. It's just a different, really kind of a body, of a legislative body. So we kept hitting hiccups related to pressure from airlines, the airline industry, which is really was the main hang up about bringing it to the floor. When we weren't able to get it there, finally our legislative champions said, you know what, we're going to bring it to the floor. We're going to call for unanimous consent. It's called a hotline, where you're saying like, this is so urgent and so important and it's free of controversy. Or so we hope that we just need to bring it forward and everyone just needs to do it. It's not a recorded vote. We just all need to say yes. Now, the problem with unanimous consent is it has to be unanimous. So it takes one objection for it to not be able to move forward. It doesn't doom the bill. It doesn't mean that the game's over. It just means that step wasn't able to proceed. And unfortunately, at that time, there was one objection on the floor, and that was really resulting from like an 11th hour pushback that came from the railway industry. So we were actually able to take that as an opportunity, because now we understood, okay, here's what the opposition is, and we can respond to that. Because again, there's so much misunderstanding across the field. If you've not been exposed to it, it can sound a little scary. So we worked with those legislators and came up with new negotiated language, understanding that there was still the sticking point of the airlines, months and months of negotiations, which included airline unions, airline industry lobbyists, you know, the breastfeeding field, those congressional folks all continued to push and push and push. Well, soon we were going to be looking at the end of that congressional session. And again, if we didn't get this done, we were going to have to start at square one. So our congressional champions decided to try again to bring it to the floor, knowing that there was a possibility of another objection. And it happened again. We brought it to the floor. There was a vying back and forth. There was definitely a response of like, it's fine, let's do a study. Is this really a problem? And unfortunately, that was all it took. It was just one objection. So it again failed on the floor. we are a stubborn folk here in the breastfeeding field. So that wasn't the end of the game. At the time, the legislative package of the appropriations was moving. So these are the federal budget bills. You know, everything that happens and supported through our federal government budget happens through these appropriations bills. And sometimes if there's enough energy, buy-in, effort, you can get different pieces of legislation added onto that appropriations package. It is not easy to do. There needs to be a pretty significant level of buy-in and negotiation and compromise from all the parties. We had tried, you know, our folks, our champions on the Hill had tried really hard to get it in. It's like literally the final days of the congressional session. There's only a couple of weeks left. That language was released. Pump Act was not included in it. It was pretty devastating. Like, my kids were like, we have not seen her cry like that. It was tough. It was tough. I am tearing up a little bit just thinking about it. You can't take lightly what it means to be trusted with this kind of work. You know, 9 million, literally 9 million babies. So thankfully our folks did not give up. They continued to push, finally really recognizing that we had to let go of including airlines or it wasn't going to happen. One day I'm going to talk about this without crying, but it's not today. So in the final, the 11th hour of the 11th hour, airlines were carved out of the legislation. And there was a vote for an amendment to amend the appropriations package, which passed with 92 yes votes in the Senate, which is an unheard of bipartisan vote, which gave it what it needed to be passed as part of appropriations language. So we were really devastated to have to make that cut for airline workers, but you know, we couldn't lose everybody else along the way. So that was kind of the story of it. It was definitely dramatic. I don't think that's necessarily typical. I don't think it's what you would necessarily expect for something. Like, we can all agree that babies are wonderful and we should support them. And yet it was very, very challenging.
What a motivating inspiration you are. I can hear the love and the passion you have for it. Just hearing you talk about the process and literal mountains that you climbed to make this happen. Thank you and everyone involved enough. This is changing the world. So thank you so much for that. What can you explain some, because I'm sure others are curious about this as I am. Why did some industries lobby against the Pump Act?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is misunderstanding. I will fully admit that there are challenges when you're talking about in an airline space is a limitation. And because of security reasons, there are a lot of rules around what you can, like spaces on airplanes. It is a challenge, but that doesn't make it impossible. So really what we were pushing for was slightly amended language. So things like you could just put Velcro over the jump seat that flight attendants need to sit in. There's wearable pumps, you know, all that kind of a thing, which we still really believe is absolutely the right path forward. But overall, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of citations around, you know, oh, employees are already doing this, it's fine, we don't need to require it. I think there was a lot of fear around the risk of litigation. So one of the points I actually didn't talk about with the Pump Act is that it not only expanded coverage to almost entirely close that coverage gap, it also provided a private right of action. So those of us who have been doing this a long time, I'm sure you know, like, you could submit a complaint with the Department of Labor if you were eligible, you know, protected by this, and your employer was not in compliance, and they could initiate an investigation, but there wasn't really a lot that could be done that would be enough of a tooth to really inspire employers to want to comply. If there's no real ramifications, You know, with non-compliance, it's a lot harder to really get employers to fully be on board. So this legislation did include a private right of action, just like for any other part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, our typical labor laws that we're all familiar with. So I think that was the biggest fear, was a fear of litigation. Now, of course, the likelihood of being struck by lightning is literally higher than the likelihood of being sued by a breastfeeding employee. I don't know about you, but when I had babes in arms, that was the furthest thing from my mind. It was a timely and expensive, you know, very long, dragged out lawsuit. But it's important to have it. We need to make sure that there's enough cause to really, if an employer doesn't want to comply with this, that there's enough for them to really push them over the edge so that they do so.
Cheryl and Jessica, I've got a question for you. And if you don't know the answer to this, I understand, and look forward to maybe reaching out at another time to get the answer. Indigenous law can be very difficult and different than just federal law and state laws. I am curious, those that are within tribal nations, that are sovereign nations, is this a law that is required for them to follow as well? Or is this something that is more of a consideration, but they don't necessarily need to follow it because of their sovereign nation title?
I
I was
can,
gonna, yeah, I was like, I bet Jessica can answer this better than I can.
well, I'm not sure that I have a full answer for you. I will tell you kind of the approach that the agency takes with enforcement. If it is a tribal nation itself, so it's hands off, right? So, but if it is a tribal member and they have a business that they are operating outside of, you know, separate from the tribe, then we consider that interstate commerce. And so it would be covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so in that event, those employers would be subject to the FLSA. However, just having said that, I have found that, you know, tribal law generally exceeds federal law in the protection of its workers.
Yes, I am very blessed where I work. We have strong protection for prenatal women, maternity leave, family leave, pumping moms. We do a lot to protect those women and those families, but I know not all tribal nations generally work that way. So I just wanted to ask. Becky, you have your hand raised. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, just on that note, Jessica, so, and of course, as you know, in Oklahoma, just to put it in perspective for me, so if it's actually a business that's run by the tribe, then that law is not going to apply to them. So somebody say that, you know, we have a lot of tribal run casinos or even tribal run hospitals. So then those would not necessarily be covered by the law. The tribe can choose to follow it, but not required. Is that correct?
Well, so I can't give you a hard and fast answer on that. You know, I'll say it depends, but generally speaking, if the tribe is the one in charge, right, the tribe's in charge, then that tribal law will generally take precedent over federal law, generally speaking. And there is a Supreme Court case. I cannot quote it right now, but I can probably try to find that and get it to you if you'd like to see it. But it was about sheep herding. I mean, it was.
I will say we do have our own breastfeeding policy within our tribal working protection act stuff, and we do uphold that over the state, but it excels or exceeds expectations of what the state had already had before this. And so not too far off from that. But I have a follow-up question about the hardship exemption. How will it be determined whether the employer has fewer than 50 employees?
So when we are counting employees, we look at everybody that works there at every location. And so that's, part-time, full-time, seasonal, exempt, non-exempt, everybody that works there at any given point is counted in that 50 mark. If it fluctuates pretty regularly at the point that the employee makes the claim, we would, on that day, did they have 50 employees on that day? And again, that's regardless of work site. So if it's a national company, or if it's a local company with 2 or more locations, we count all of those employees at all work sites. Whether the compliance would be an undue hardship, it's determined on a case-by-case basis, right? We look at the employee, what they do, and then if there's any way for that employer to comply, and then the employer actually bears the burden of proof to say, hey, we really can't do this. And because, it's a law of minimums, just the FLSA is just a law of minimums in general. And it's for 1 year, right? It's not very long. And the only requirement is space and time, right? And so it's not too hard to do. So because of that, any employer who asks for this exemption is going to have to demonstrate a significant difficulty or expense in trying to get that exemption. We don't see very many of these cases. Unfortunately, I think the reason we don't see very many cases is because this law is just not very well known in general. But the cases that we have seen, there's a way, right? You just got to, maybe you have to get creative, but there's a way to make it happen. And so we don't usually allow for those hardship exemptions, but it's up to the employer to show us proof if that's what they want to pursue.
Becky?
Sorry. Well, since you brought up that there is a time limit of a year, so this could be for either Cheryl or Jessica and y'all. And one of the questions you asked early on, Laura, was, or stated, that you see the PUMP Act as a floor, not the end. And so do you see, and now that the AAP policy statement says, recommends breastfeeding, for 2 years or longer, do you see starting to, at some point, change that? So
I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised. There's a lot of states that have laws in place that extend for longer than a year. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, hopefully what we're going to see is that this is, law is a major driver of cultural shifts. So breastfeeding in the workplace was completely not at all considered like in the realm of possibility a few decades ago. And now it's, there's been increased exposure. Hopefully what the PUMP Act is, what we're actually going to see is this becoming normal, where it's no big deal. You just plan for it. You kind of know what to do, just like you would handle anything else in the workplace. And I think as that becomes clearer and easier, and it's just part of the normal culture of our nation, that hopefully we will be looking at, extending that for longer times. The reality is that so few, like Laura, I loved hearing your breastfeeding story. Like, that's unfortunately an anomaly. Like we see how low those rates are at a year. So securing it for the first year is a priority, but hopefully what we're going to see is more families being able to breastfeed for as long as they wish and be asking for this longer. I mean, the truth is, if you're already providing it for a year, like, you know, why there's not really a reason to change it necessarily in a lot of cases. I think the other thing that I expect we'll see is that this actually was included in the House bill and didn't make it into the final. But in cases of like adoption, surrogacy, that those employees would also be protected for their right to pump. So I would expect that both time and, you know, some of those little bit like less traditional circumstances, you know, hopefully one day we'll go there with our next generation of really smart, savvy advocates.
All right, that brought up one more question on that point, Cheryl, of thinking of other groups that are not protected. I know we have some of our milk bank crew on here today too. So what about bereaved donors?
Yeah, that was part of that House bill too. Yeah, that was included and unfortunate. And that was incredibly bipartisan, I will say, on the House side. It had incredible support in committee, but unfortunately was not included in the final bill, because we've unfortunately heard of stories of parents who've lost a child, and this is how they're handling their grief. What a beautiful way, you know, to honor that child, and they're actually being told, nope, sorry, you're not protected because this child is not with us. I mean, unacceptable.
Well, and also, isn't it true, Becky and Cheryl, that if you receive Medicaid benefits, and you suffer a pregnancy loss, you don't qualify for a pump, correct?
Oh, I don't know about that. I hope that's not true, but I'm worried that it is.
Well, in Oklahoma, our it's lower income families are going to get pumps through the WIC program, and WIC is not allowed to issue a pump if there's
Right.
not a baby. So
Right.
they can't issue
Right, that's what I
prenatally.
meant, WIC.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Oh,
I will say within our agency, the way we go around issuing a pump to moms that do not have a baby is through our loaner pump program. Those, though, are basically 1 month at a time. So it keeps us where we have to check in with them, but at the same time, you know, sometimes it just doesn't work out. But that is something our agency, it's more specialized in case by case scenario. Whatever the situation is as to why mom does not have baby, we are protected under that we are able to do a loaner pump, but it wouldn't be one that she can keep. Yeah. I do have, yeah.
oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to add that this is something we see. We haven't really dug into paid family leave all that much, but that's a piece that I'm seeing happening a lot. So like one of the jobs that I have is tracking what's happening in different states around the country. And unfortunately, bereaved mothers are often not protected under state paid family and leave programs. Obviously, on the federal, we don't have any paid family and medical leave. But there's tons of bills being introduced that are specifically looking at pregnancy loss. So it is part of the conversation, which gives us hope for the future.
So we know that overall, the U.S. Recommends exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months or longer, and overall we are shooting, 2 years. Hopefully, is the new recommendation that we are shooting for. With all the data and everything that is significant health barriers and benefits with breastfeeding and with pumping, what do you think, besides the limited support of pumping, are there other barriers to breastfeeding in the workplace besides that not having that protection of pumping? And this could be for either one of you.
Yeah, Jessica, feel free to cut me off if you have thoughts. I think some of the issues that I've seen are like uniform adjustments are a major issue for some like police officers if they have a bulletproof vest or they're specific. I mean, I remember during pregnancy being like, you have to wear this polo shirt. And I was like, okay. We'll see. That's a major issue that comes up. It sounds kind of silly, but that does matter if that's like a basic requirement of your job. There are also issues sometimes with milk storage. So that is something that it's not specifically addressed in the bill language, but Jessica would be able to share more about it. But in the Wage and Hour Division has released a field bulletin and in the FAQs and the department's interpretation of that, it also requires you being able to have a safe place to store your milk. So I think that's an important message to share, like for folks, especially if they're surrounded by chemicals or like other, like a construction site, like they need to know that their milk is going to be safe and okay for their baby. So those are two issues that immediately come to mind for me.
Thank you. Yes, we are facing that as well. We are trying to get written a policy for the protection of stored milk and support of stored milk. So yes, that is a big one that we see already. Absolutely. Jessica, this one's for you, and I hate to backtrack too much, but I am curious that if we are aware of an employer or our employer even, or maybe we're working with a client who has an employer that is not in compliance, what are some ways that we can let that be known, aware, support our person, our client for speaking up for themselves?
Well, I would say, first and foremost, just like with the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, communication between the employee and the employer is key, right? Nothing is good's going to happen unless the employer and the employee can, talk it out and come up with solutions that meet the needs of the worker. And also some creativity, right? You've got people on oil field locations or construction sites and in a crop field. So you've got to come up, and it's not necessarily the employee's responsibility to do that, but I would say the communication, if they have ideas of what they need, that's the first step. And then also giving employers as much notice as possible to allow them to prepare. So when the mom goes out on maternity leave and she says, okay, when I come back, I'm going to need this space to pump. Well, that gives the employer a little extra time to kind of be thinking about how are we going to make this work. And then, of course, try not to be confrontational. As a mom, I know I was a wreck a lot. I was exhausted and just, having to leave the baby to go back to work. It was just, emotions come into play here. But trying to not be confrontational or maintain professional demeanor. Okay. That's kind of ahead of the game. If you've done all this and they're still not complying, and the employee is comfortable approaching the employer on their own, we have a lot of sources on our website. The law itself, there's some fact sheets, that bulletin that Cheryl mentioned, all of that's available on our website, and I'll share that now on the chat. Print that out or take it to the employer and say, look, this is the law. I need you to help me out here. And if they still refuse, or if the employee is not comfortable doing that, they can call us and file a complaint. And I'll type in a minute, I'll type the number to call to do that. There's never a charge to file a complaint. We do investigations for free. I mean, we're taxpayer funded. So filing the complaint is kind of the easiest and least expensive approach. Basically, we turn into a mediator, right? So the investigator comes in and they work and they advocate on behalf of the worker to get the employer to come into compliance. And, sometimes we can do, particularly if there's something like retaliation is involved. So if an employee has gone to the employer and said, hey, I need this protection, and the employer retaliates against them by either, moving them to demoting them or firing them or creating a hostile work environment, we can come in and we can, that's a completely separate section of the law, actually. So retaliation, but there's civil money penalties, liquidated damages, lost wages. So there are a few things that we can utilize to help make that employee whole. But generally speaking, the ultimate goal is to bring them into compliance and then also have them meet the needs of the worker. So if they don't want to go that direction, as Cheryl said, there is a right to private action, so they can file a private lawsuit. Now, it is important to know that once a lawsuit is filed, Wage and Hour will no longer pursue an investigation. So if there's one active, when you call us, we're going to say we can't do anything. There's an active litigation going. Or if you have filed a complaint and then later file a private lawsuit, we'll close the complaint. So that's just a few of the options there.
Thank you for that. That's very insightful and very helpful. Cheryl, give me your kind of expectations or hopes on what this PUMP Act ultimately means for the health outcomes of the U.S.
Yeah, I love this question. So what we know is that right now, going back to work is one of the biggest barriers for breastfeeding parents. So we see as moms or new parents go back to work, those numbers just plummet. I think that what we're going to see is a modest increase in breastfeeding rates over time. Of course, it's going to be dependent on the implementation of the law and how well it's understood and, embraced and all these things. But I feel very optimistic that we're going to see some increases. And those increases are going to have big implications, not only for health of mom, but for health of baby, but also for health of mom. So, I'm sure none of this is a surprise to any of us on here, but there's a reason why globally, nationally, state, local, all these levels of leadership have prioritized breastfeeding among their health goals. And that's because of the impact that it has on respiratory illness and decreasing obesity. It reduces cancer risk, real, very impactful health challenges can be completely prevented when we have these population level changes that allow people to feed their babies in the biologically normal way. So I do have hope for what this will mean for health outcomes. At the same time, we are also just coming out of the pandemic. A lot of the drivers of chronic disease have been significantly increased, much more sedentary lifestyles, the inflation and the way that's impacted people's diets and all these things are very real. So of course those are going to have a little bit of balancing effects, but it's definitely going to be a positive step forward. So I'm happy for that. I unfortunately am going to have to run. We actually have a workplace support constellation meeting next hour where we are going to talk about the Wage and Hour Division Field Bulletin. Very excited about that. But please, I'll pop my email into the chat. And if anyone has questions or there's anything I didn't answer, please do feel free to reach out. And just thanks so much for having me. This was wonderful. And I learned so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Jessica, I'll go ahead and ask you another question, if that's okay. So when employers have to provide a space to pump, does this mean that this is a unique central space that should be pretty much well I would say, accessible throughout the year, even if there's not a nursing mother? Or is this something that they should just form every time that they have a nursing mother?
That really is up to the employer. The law only requires the space if there's a need for it. And also it doesn't require a permanent space. It can be a temporary space. So if they want to, allocate an office, or if they have an office and that person just leaves and they get to use it, if it's conference room, it really is up to the employer as far as whether they want to make a permanent room or not. The law just requires that if the space is needed, it is made available at the time it's needed.
So would this law also cover off-site work trips?
So the important thing to remember here is the law applies regardless of work site. Okay, and so the Pump Act itself doesn't speak specifically to travel status. We would look at the travel provisions in the Fair Labor Standards Act and the regulations to determine whether or not if the employee is in work status, or they're performing hours worked, they would be considered covered under the law during those times. But regardless of where that work is being performed, unless you're a pilot or a flight attendant, there has to be a way to the time and the space have to be made available to those employees. The other thing that the law actually cites is that employees who telework are eligible to take the breaks just, as the same basis as other employees. And they have to be shielded from view from any type of recording device. So, they can't be made to sit in front of their webcam or, in a conference room that has a camera. So they have to be truly shielded, and it has to be a private space. And that's outlined in the law as well.
Thank you so much. I do want to point out, Jonathan was not able to sit in on this panel. Heidi, can you share his NPR interview? He did a great interview about being able to provide 8-week paid leave for families and installing the Momvas pumping pods. He's done some great work. It's a 3-4 minute listen. I do encourage you all to read it. It is very impressive, the support he's giving his employees. And I look forward to hearing some expansion from 8 weeks to 12 weeks for those families. Heidi, I am done with questions. Do you have any questions that popped up in your head while we were discussing?
I will go ahead and put that in there. I have put one of his interviews in the chat, and we are really missing Jonathan today. He had an urgent issue that he was dealing with at Fowler Automotive. And what I really loved about one of the interviews is, you think about, he sells cars, and they're like, what does selling cars have anything to do with breastfeeding? And I specifically remember it was almost 3 years ago when Alexis Barizia from COBA and La Leche League and a couple of my other friends sent me, I think it was about 10 people within one day, sent me a link and said, you need to meet Jonathan Fowler. He put Mama Pods in all of his dealerships. And I was like, who's Jonathan Fowler? Well, it just so happens one of our COBA supporters and COBA board members, Jerry and Michael Thomas with Amshot, they're good friends with Jonathan. And so I sent a message to them and I'm like, can you hook me up, with Jonathan Fowler? But I was thinking about, one, how stressful it is really to go buy a car. Buying a car is not always the easiest process. It takes a really long time. And then I was thinking about going to buy a car with small children or going by a car with small children while you are also breastfeeding your infant. And Jonathan talked about it wasn't until he became a dad and witnessed the difficulty in his family, his wife breastfeeding, that he said the personal becomes the passionate. And even though Jonathan is not able to be here today, I want to give a round of applause and a hats off, because they are the first automotive dealership in the country to have mama pods in their dealerships. So that again kind of brings about also an interview that he talked about paid leave and how important it is for us as moms and breastfeeding parents to be able to have the support of our employer, not just with a private lactation space, but also to not be so stressed out that I'm going to be off work for how many weeks without that income. Again, we are the only country in the world that does not have a paid leave policy. And I know that Becky sees that a lot in terms of the breastfeeding support that is provided through the Oklahoma Breastfeeding Resource Center and the 800 hotline. I think Jacqueline Huxford is on the call today. We in Oklahoma are really fortunate that we have that, and that actually can be used by any citizen throughout the United States. You don't have to be an Oklahoman, but we know that all of the difficulties of just adjusting to go back to work. I was thinking about a friend of mine who used to be a news anchor for Channel 4, and one of the first jobs, right out of the shoot after having a baby, she was like, I can do this. She actually ended up feeding her daughter for two years, but she was like, I can do this. I'm going to go back to work early. She went back to work and covered a tornado like her first day. And she was in the photographer's van covered up, and he was like, hey, do you need a cover up? So paid leave is something that we've seen quite a bit of here in Oklahoma. Becky, we talked about paid leave for Oklahoma teachers. I think that's in the new education bill here in Oklahoma, where if you are a public school teacher, and I think if you have been employed for a year, you will be qualifying for, I think it's 8 weeks paid leave. And then also the House has been debating whether to provide paid leave for state workers, breastfeeding parents who are state workers. And I believe you would qualify if you were 2 years.
But do we maybe see any other questions from our audience as we're getting to the end of our time here? I think we just had in the chat and stuff. So lots of information in the chat. So be sure to check that. So Heidi,
Well, Jessica, I don't know exactly if you can address this, with your position, but in talking about creative ways that the companies can kind of go above and beyond maybe the law and be supportive with employees. Can you give us examples of some of those creative ways that you've seen with different employees? I know that Oklahoma, through the Oklahoma State Department of Health and through COBA, we have the breastfeeding friendly worksite designation that I think we have almost 400 organizations and companies, but can you share with us some creative ways that you've seen employees be supported?
Well, I will tell you that I've not seen a lot, but we do make a lot of referrals. And, I gave out Nancy Bacon's number. I can't even tell you how many times when, for the work friendly workplace. So, and I was like, Nancy, I'm sure can help you with this. So, and this was even, like I said, we don't have a lot of investigations, but we do have some, people will call sometimes and ask for suggestions honestly, we are not even supposed to give suggestions in our positions. But, you know, sometimes when you're in an investigation and you just see something that seems a little bit obvious and maybe the employer didn't see it, you can point it out. But, you know, one thing that comes to mind is a shared space. So for instance, if, you know, maybe it's a shopping center, right? And each individual store doesn't have the space to set up an area for pumping. They can, you know, cooperate and get together with other stores in the same area and have a shared space for that. But then, of course, you have, you know, scheduling issues sometimes, and you have to make sure that the mothers who need that space have it available to them when they need it. You know, other things like, you know, a pop-up tent. But then in that case, they have to have, if, say, for instance, if they're on a construction site, you know, whether it's in the vehicle and they have a pop-up to cover all the windows, and they can use a car charger for that. Or if they have a pump that works on a battery or a manual pump out in the field, like in an agricultural field, you know, the thing we have to stay away from is, oh, go to the porta potty. And we have to remind employers all the time, you know, because they'll say, oh, but our bathroom is so nice, it has this little rest area. And I'm like, would you prepare your food in a bathroom? And the answer is no, you're not going to do that. And so no matter how nice the bathroom is or how nice the rest area is, the answer is no. But I think the pop-ups, you know, the little pop-up tents are one of, you know, kind of it's not a great solution, but it is a solution that I've seen. And then the shared spaces.
Yeah. All right. Well, Heidi, I'm just, doing a time check. I think we probably time to call this a wrap. And I just want to, say a big thank you to Jessica and Cheryl for being our panelist, and then Laura for being our moderator. Good job for everyone. And I hope this was helpful and informative. I know I certainly learned some new things today as well. So stay tuned for more information from COBA in your inbox. We'll be having a newsletter coming out, and everyone, stay safe out there.
Thanks for joining us.